back, everybody, and today we're going to continue on with decision making and problem solving. Today we're going to take a look at the different models there are of decision making. We're going to take a look at the rational model, the behavioral model, and we're going to take a look at evidence-based models. So you probably didn't know there were that many models out there when it comes to decision making, but there are, and we'll take a look at those today. Okay, everybody, let's continue on today with decision making and problem solving. And today we're going to take a look at some of the different theories when it comes to decision making and the models. The first one we have here is the rational approach. Now, if you remember yesterday, I told you there were three different types. There's the behavioral, there's the rational, and then we'll go on to the third one, which is pretty much evidence-based and ties off of behavioral. But the rational approach, as you see here, is a systematic step-by-step process for making decisions. Now, as you can see, there's several steps to it. Let me go ahead and again just map out all of it at once so that we can take a look at it. First of all, know your goals. What is it that you're trying to accomplish here? If you're trying to decrease absenteeism, or if you're trying to increase productivity, what is the goal that is bringing you together to make a decision in the first place? The second issue that you're going to have to deal with is to identify the problem. Now, identifying the problem can be tricky. Oftentimes, we look at the symptom, and the symptom will mislead us at times. It can divert our attention from the main issue that we need to focus on. For instance, let's say, for instance, your company has experienced a 30% decrease in sales over the past quarter, and you get everybody in your group together. You've got executives from each of your departments, and let's say you're the CEO, and you say, listen guys, we have a problem here. What's going on with our sales? And they can come up with all kinds of excuses. Well, research and development has been lagging, and marketing hasn't been doing their job, and finance has not given us the money. Oftentimes you get into a blame fest where people are pointing the finger at each other. And sometimes, they don't really go at each other aggressively, but they can just look at possible reasons for the decrease in sales and still not get to the problem. The problem in this example that I just gave you is the 30% decrease in sales. That's it. That's the problem. Now from there, you need to determine the decision type. Is this going to be something that we have data on, which would be more along the program decision, or is this going to be something new that we've never dealt with, which would be non-program decision? Now, if it's non-programmed and you don't have a decision rule and there are no protocols for what you're going through, then you're going to have to get into the meat and potatoes. And that means, first of all, you're going to have to generate alternatives. Now, this can be problematic. The reason being is that some people don't like to voice their opinion, but you need some recommendations. Now that we have identified the problem, how can we get back the 30% that we lost? And here you need to be able to solicit the input of all of your people. And in this case, any and everybody could be a part of the solution and give you good alternatives. But again, many people may be intimidated by people in the room. Other people may want to prevent losing face or being laughed at, and they may not say anything. And then you've got problems because they may be the ones with the solution. I have a exercise that I do with people that get them together, and they have to problem solve a situation. And usually the ones who were the most quiet were the ones who had the best solutions and alternatives for that particular situation. But because other people were very outgoing and assertive, they kind of intimidated the others and they didn't speak. And the ones who were the know-it-alls were the ones that got them all in trouble because they gave bad alternatives. So here you want to generate as many alternatives as possible. Now, you have different options in generating alternatives at your disposal. There's something called the Delphi technique. And the Delphi technique is where you send out questionnaires and they bring it back, and then you get down a little bit more to what the problem is, or not the problem, but the solution may be. And you just send out a series of questionnaires to people until you eventually come to the answer. That's time consuming, but it does guarantee anonymity. There's also called the nominal group technique, NGT, which you can take a box or a hat or whatever and have people write down solutions or alternatives, and they put it in the hat or the box, and you write those alternatives up on the board. No one speaks during this time, but you are putting up every person's response, and then after that you evaluate them, which is the next step. The last step, or the other option that you may have, is brainstorming, which you just throw out crazy ideas and good ideas, and no one really knows which one is which. So that kind of alleviates some of the pressure of not looking foolish, because you're throwing out silly answers just as well as good answers and so forth. So those are some ways that you can generate alternatives. And then the next step, as you see, is to evaluate the alternatives. And again, the formula for that is the alternative that has the greatest amount of payoff at the least amount of risk or cost. So you want to evaluate those alternatives for that end result, and then choose an alternative. Oftentimes we will choose an alternative and let it be that. And the government is horrendous in doing that. A lot of man hours and money has been wasted because we have spent a lot of time, and I was in the government, coming up with all of these alternatives, and then we choose an alternative but we don't implement it. And that's just, with it not being implemented, it's just a good idea that never got off the ground. So implement the plan after you choose the alternative that's going to work for you. And then finally we have control, which means to measure and adjust. How do we know if this alternative is working for us? Well, we can set milestones. After each month, for the next quarter, we should have a 10% increase until we reach and recoup the 30% that we've lost. If you can do that, then you know you've come to a good decision. If not, then you can reevaluate, and then you can adjust it as you go along. So the last thing in the world you want to do is decide on something and just leave it alone and see if it works, and you don't evaluate it until the end. What if you made the wrong decision? What if you don't have the resources or capabilities of making that decision come into fruition? So control is the last and probably one of the most overlooked in business, but it is necessary if you're going to be an effective decision maker. Figure 8.3 just shows you a diagram of what we've just talked about. All along here, notice information, 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 information. Whether it's programmed or non-programmed, you need information. That means you need the most accurate, the most relevant, the most valuable, and the most attractive information so that the right decision can be made. And again, it makes no difference if it's programmed or non-programmed. Information is going to be the key. Now, with the rational approach, you do have strengths and weaknesses. First of all, the strength is that this is a logical, sequential model that forces you to make decisions in that framework. It enables you to choose on the basis of information rather than emotion or social pressure. You're not evaluating people, you're evaluating alternatives, and you're evaluating the problem. However, there are some weaknesses. It can be rigid, and sometimes underlying assumptions are often realistic. You may think that just because we sit around and we come up with ideas that there's going to be a right idea, and you may not be able to do that. You can be limited by the amount of time that you have or costs, because you do have to get people together. You do have to go through these processes. Not all alternatives are easily quantified. How do we measure employee happiness? If that was one of the things that you wanted to solve, a problem that you wanted to solve, how can we increase morale or happiness? How do we quantify that? So some of these alternatives may not be easily quantified. Also, the outcomes can be unknown. Even though you have the right alternative, you don't know what it's actually going to do as far as predictability, especially as tumultuous as our environment is today in business. Now, there's another model that we talked about, or I just mentioned a while ago, that is based on evidence decision making. Now, this is where you may not be able to come across with just a logical approach. You may have to just do what you can do based on the information that you have. And this is evidence-based management. Let's say, for instance, and the book talks about employee performance. Should we give performance-based raises? Well, evidence shows that performance-based raises are good for individuals, but they're not good for groups. So, based on the evidence that you find, you make decisions on that. Now, they give you some principles for this, and they say that you have to face hard facts and build a culture where people are encouraged to tell the truth, even if it is unpleasant. Hey, I've worked in groups before, and we were paid for performance, and half the people in the group didn't want to work because they knew that the other half would work, and it lowered our morale. You have to be, even when people think it's a good idea, you have to be honest and straightforward in what you have experienced. It has to be committed to fact-based decisions, and that's getting the best evidence and using it to guide your actions. You need to treat your organization as an unfinished prototype, and sometimes you'll have to experiment and learn by doing. You look for the risks and drawbacks and what people recommend, and also avoid basing decisions on untested beliefs. Now, you can see how maybe your company didn't do, and let's use pay raises again. Maybe your company hasn't gone to a performance-based pay structure. Maybe you're on hourly wages, but you want to try that. Even though your company hasn't done that, you can look at other companies that have ventured out into pay for performance type structures and be able to see the evidence there and whether or not they would or that model would fit your company. So just being able to look at what facts you can accumulate can help you in evidence-based decision making. Now, there's the behavioral approach, and here we have the administrative model, and it assumes that decision makers operate within bounded rationality rather than with perfect rationality. In other words, life happens, and not everything is a textbook world. where we can make decisions and so forth. There's a condition, or there's a phenomenon called bounded rationality, which says that decision making is based upon a meaningful subset of relevant information. Now, bounded rationality means that your rational application of decision making is bounded, or it's restricted. There may be costs, there may be time constraints where you have to make a quick decision, or you don't have the money or the resources to get everything that you need. So you can use bounded rationality, which is taking some of the ideas that you have and doing the best that you can with it. Now, characteristics of this model is that you have rule and thumb procedures. For instance, the book talks about marketing, and how marketing is tied in with maybe money. And if you have a similar situation, you could tie that into what you've done before, and that can be your rule of thumb. Whenever we are facing a situation where we are dropping or seeing a drop in our productivity, we've done this in the past, so that's our rule of thumb. This is how we're going to operate. You also have what's called sub-optimizing, and that's accepting less than the best outcomes. You may have 10 different alternatives to a problem, but you don't have time to evaluate all of those alternatives to that problem. So what do? You pick maybe the top two that sound good, and you run with it. You figure out of those two which are going to be the best. Sub-optimizing also may be compromise, and your book talks about how in times of economic depression, maybe you're a motor manufacturer and you want to just stick with one model of production, and other people may believe that you need to have multiple models going to put more out there into the marketplace. So sub-optimizing may be the middle of the road approach. You choose just a few that are similar to the one that you are producing right now, and you just run with that. So sub-optimizing is kind of like a compromise, or we'll take the middle of the road approach. And then satisficing, and I talked about satisficing yesterday, where you're choosing the first encountered alternative that solves the problem. And that's really doing the best with what you've got. You've got a lot of really obstacles within bounded rationality, and satisficing means that you're not going to have all the information all the time that's going to fit every scenario and situation. So the first option, or the first alternative that seems to solve the problem, that's what you're going to run with, and that's what you're going to choose. Now, there are other decision-making forces. When it comes to the behavioral approach, you have political forces. And as your book indicates, you may have stockholders who are pressuring the board of directors to go in one direction, and if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. And there's politics within the company as well, not just above and beyond the CEO. Intuition. A lot of managers still like to go off the cuff and use intuition. This just feels right, and that can get you in trouble. Now there is some merit in people's intuition, especially when it comes to their experience with that company. They know what works and what doesn't to a large extent, and you can use some of that, but you have to realize also that in business today, things are evolving. The way it used to be is no longer the way it used to be. We're in a different world now. Escalation of commitment, risk propensity, ethics, all of these have an influence on the behavioral model, and you just need to be aware of it. Prospect theory. argues that when people make decisions under a condition of risk, they are more motivated to avoid losses than they are to seek gains. So here is the safety net. Let's just make a decision that's going to be safe so that we don't lose big in this decision, but yet we're not going to gain either. So that's, in some cases, that will work, but also you have to realize too that risk just goes along with the environment today. There are some risks that you're going to have to take. Hopefully they're going to be calculated and you'll have some idea of what the result is going to be. But prospect theory just says that when times or conditions are right, that people will usually choose the decision that will avoid losses rather than to seek gains. Now you have other approaches. I'm not really going to focus a lot on those. You have the integrated approach, which combines the rational with the behavioral to kind of even out the extremes or the polar opposites of each one of those models to kind of make it more homogeneous. Hybrid approaches, where you're using just a combination of all of these models. Research has shown that speed in decision making is not indicative of the consideration of fewer alternatives by managers. So, whatever works, that's what you use, and that's really the rule of thumb. You have a lot of options when it comes to models, but realistically, by using the rational and understanding that even though you use a logical, systematic approach, that sometimes things happen, you're just going to have to make the best decision with what you've got. You'll be fine in knowing that. Now, the last slide that we have today, again, we see the same old requirement, information, whether it's programmed, non-programmed. You're really looking at a practical approach, which means look at the situation, identify the problem, whether it's programmed or non-programmed, evaluate alternatives, and choose the best alternatives, implement it, and then measure. Now, folks, this isn't rocket science. It is a basic, no matter what you choose, it is a basic format, it's a basic platform for which decisions can be made and made effectively. So incorporating these will help you become more effective in your role as whether a pastor, a minister, a business leader, or whatever it may be that you're trying to do in making decisions, whether it's personal or professional also. This model or these models will help you a long way. Well, today we took a look at the different models of decision making, and we saw some of the hybrids, and we saw some of the new models that are out there today. It all boils down, folks, though, to making the best decision with the information that you have available. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's difficult, as information can be difficult to obtain, especially information that's going to be timely and will be there for you when you need it. So the best we can do is the best we can do. These models will work, but it's knowing which model to use in what situation, giving the constraints that our environment places upon us. Well, that's all we have for today. You have a good day, and we'll finish up tomorrow.